Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwindt.
I'm Jared Pechaček.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to By-The-Bywater, third episode here, and we have just spent almost an hour trying to get this episode recorded, so we want you listeners to know, we're working for you. We really are.
Putting in that sweat. I have all my windows closed for, noise purposes, and it is quite warm in this apartment, but it's all for you, listeners. It's all for you.
Living in one of the 300 buildings in Seattle that don't have air conditioning. Sitting here with my fan off, so yeah.
and I too, San Francisco, air conditioning, not a common thing. This is not this was not the heat wave from 2 weeks ago. That was miserable. But it wasn't last week, because last week at this time, I was suffering through the world's worst sinus infection. You do not need any TMI from me. Just suffice to say, I would have been no. So the timing is good. We are here. We're very very glad to have you back. Thank you again for continuing to listen to us. Feedback, thoughts, as always, appreciated. Contact information in the show notes and at the end of our broadcast here. And if I do sound a little hoarse or a little nasally at points, it is because of that little sort of worst cold imaginable that I'm still getting over. But, I'll try and make it as good as possible. Anyway, we've been running a bit late. We don't want to keep you guys going too long, so we will now kick in with a short version of the news.
So the only major news concerns Amazon's forthcoming TV series. Bryan Cogman has joined the writing team of J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay. I never know how to say that. As a consultant, Cogman was a longtime assistant to the creative team on Game of Thrones, wrote numerous episodes for the series, as well as developing a pilot that I guess HBO decided not to pick up. Cogman signed an Amazon deal last year, so this is essentially an in-house move, but his reputation and experience definitely sound like a key factor here.
Oh yeah, I'm super super excited about this. Cogman is often described as sort of the heart and soul of Game of Thrones. Huge fan, and I think that he will really bring a lot of I don't know anyone else involved in the production, but he himself is a really good guy. A lot of heart. Really good understanding of character and drive. Saw a lot of people with the opinion that Benioff and Weiss, the Game of Thrones showrunners, should have just handed the reins to him for the final season, because he was very passionate about it. So, good job, Amazon.
It does sound like this is kind of my thought, given his experience in working on such a tightly cycled series, you could say, that on the one hand, it seems like one of the things he can definitely bring is a sense of how to keep a pacing season by season going, however it comes out. The flip to that being that it'll be a case where unlike Game of Thrones, where you at least had, a fairly tight structure of books and, a certain drive going forward, this is so much more wide that it'll be interesting to see how that momentum, shall we say, carries season for season. That would be kind of a new experience for him, I would think. Still no word on casting, still no word on anything else, but we will see what happens.
I cannot wait to get mad about casting.
Yeah!
I cannot wait to be like, that's not the right Tar Muriel or whatever,
Celebrimbor is not like that. I don't understand. You cast
Sauron with Tom Hiddleston? God, it's so expected.
Everyone knows that Gil-galad should be played by John Cho. Anyway.
Oh my god, I actually would be so into that.
I would too, frankly. I think that'd be fantastic. Just someone should do it. Absolutely.
This is now a fan cast show.
Yes! Well, that actually plays really well into my idea for Fëanor being Daniel Wu. I don't know if you guys ever saw any of Into the Badlands, but for some reason that has been my, weird little... It's in my heart.
So so they'll doubtless be more fan casting in the near future from all of us.
Yeah, we can't seem to help ourselves.
Yeah, no, I mean, we'll have 8 million imaginary versions of the show, all of which will be better than the real thing, of course. So, but, okay, so with that said, and to keep it from getting too lost in loops here, let's kick into our main topic discussion, led off this time by Jared. Jared, go ahead and take it away.
So I picked Melian to talk about this time because I love her so much. But then I sat down to like actually sort out my thoughts about her and realized like I don't know who she is. Like she's really cool, but she's very much on the periphery of everything. Mm-hmm. She doesn't do an awful lot that really drives the story forward. She doesn't have any long-term goals except to like keep everybody safe, which is awesome. For those of you who don't know, and I'm kind of assuming if you're listening to the show, you probably know who she is, but whatever. She's a Maia, so she's essentially a minor goddess. According to some versions of the story, she's the most beautiful of the Maiar. She's associated with nightingales, and she's related to Yavanna, who's kind of the goddess of plants and animals and all that. And she's a singer who is so powerful, so Orpheus-like, that Valinor will stop and listen when she sings. But then she just sort of leaves from Middle-earth, because that's where the action is. I don't know. Because she likes to wander in the darkness and sing or something like that. And that's cool.
So like, emo! I can relate.
Yeah. And then while she's there, she meets Elwë, who's one of the first elves who's leading his people to Valinor. It's love at first sight. He sees her. They're both so smitten. They stand there staring at each other for, I think, like 200 years or something. And then he becomes king of a realm in Middle-earth, and she uses her power to defend it and all that, and that's all cool. So that's how Melian begins. And it's interesting to me that it's this love at first sight thing, which happens over and over in Tolkien. It happens for Melian and Elwë, obviously, but it also happens to Beren and Luthien, and then to Aragorn and Arwen. The women in these couples are all actually related to each other, which is a whole other thing. And they love each other so much that Elwë gives up going back to Valinor, and she does too, and they both stay in Middle-earth, and she takes on mortal form, which is a big deal, because I think she's the first of her kind to do that. And then they set up this kingdom in Middle-earth, and things go on like that for centuries. It's her power that keeps the kingdom safe. She's the one who suggests building the underground city that they live in, and she's his advisor and, I don't know, essentially court wizard for centuries, and then has Luthien, who is, in terms of story, actually more important than her. But we all know about Luthien, so Melian is more interesting to me. But whenever people talk about her, it's always this sort of background role, like she's the one, in a sense, who just kind of keeps house for everybody. They all return to Doriath or leave Doriath, and she's just always there. And that makes sense, because it's a story of war. She's going to be off stage, but she's always just defined by by being the side character in everybody else's story.
She's like an accessory, essentially. Like,
kind of, yeah. She's Elwë's wife. She's Luthien's mother. She's Galadriel's friend. She's always in relation to somebody else, and she's usually giving advice that gets ignored. Don't do this, you will be unhappy. And then they go and do it, and she's just like, well, I said. So she just stays unknown for most of the time. And maybe that mystery is why she's so interesting to me. She's just always so quiet, but always present. And her power, the girdle of Melian that defends Doriath, is like a maze of mist and insanity that just keeps everybody out. And that's pretty dark for a character who's like, a good character. And whenever she is in a story that involves a human, that human usually ends up unhappy. Not like because of her, but she'll usually say, like, she gives that advice, and they'll either follow it and it goes poorly, or they don't follow it and it goes poorly.
Yeah.
So, considering she is like the only major divine character in Middle-earth, I wonder if she just is opaque because nobody is capable of understanding her, including the people who are telling these stories about her, because Silmarillion is like in-universe, a set of legends. Mm-hmm. Having said all that, just, I don't know, I want to switch gears because there's not a whole lot that really is known about her. The fact that she's divine and then, like, takes on flesh out of love is, like, pretty Christian. And Tolkien was all about that. It's a little more like Lady of the Lake than actual Christ, but whatever. And then the other thing is she, like so many other powerful women in Tolkien's work, reminds me of Edith Tolkien, his wife, who was apparently older than him, just like Melian, Luthien, and Arwen are all older than their husbands. She's musically inclined, and their relationship just ends up sort of getting refracted throughout all of his work.
Yeah.
Which is really cool to me. He just, he loves Edith so much that he's just, whenever she shows up in his story as somebody else, that person is always, the coolest person on the planet at that time. Yeah, it's almost, in a way, as if all of his work is, on some level, a love letter to his wife, which is really cool. Or maybe I'm just, hopelessly romantic.
Sap!
Yeah, I've seen too
Jared's
many
a sap!
Yeah.
I love it.
So, I don't know. To me, I mean, in a sense, Melian is Edith, but what do you guys think?
No, I think you're right. I think it is interesting because the relationships are, you've got your three pairs, Melian and Elwë and Luthien and Beren and Aragorn and Arwen, and they are very similar relationships, but at the same time there are differences between them, and I think that is it's almost different facets of their relationship echoing through time. I think that's beautiful, as you have pointed out.
Oriana's a sap too.
I am a sap. I didn't like that you were mirroring my own.
That keeps happening.
Well, it's interesting, too, thinking about, the fates that have intertwined. It suddenly occurred to me about, how advice is given and not taken or not taken, is that the story of Turin and Finduilas is almost like the failed rerun of Beren and Luthien to a degree. It's sort of like, and again, this is much less intentional, but again, Melian and her involvement and Thingol's involvement, this is at the start of Turin's story, and where it goes from there. It's one of those things that, even though the ending is sad, one reason why I think the appeal of the story is, as you're seeing it through Tolkien's, you're refracting it through his eyes, is that it was a love that lasted. It was something that is that even if the ending wasn't guaranteed, there was definitely something there. All right. Well, in terms of where Melian is right now, clearly she's knocking back margaritas with Yavanna, enjoying retirement, because why wouldn't you when you've been around since the beginning of creation? You've got the time. But, aside from that, aside from wine coolers on the beach, let's see.
I am now picturing Melian and Yavanna, and they're trying to get Nienna to come out from the forests, or from the edge of the world, and get her to come to the beach at Alqualand. Alqualande, I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce it.
Alqualande.
Yeah, trying to get her to come to the beach with the promise of wine coolers and oh my God, the beautiful sand and the pearls strewn on. Oh my God.
Also, they're not wine coolers; they're mead coolers.
Yes,
Come on.
yes.
Or it's Miravore.
Yes.
Or it's Miravore.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so that Big Little Lies season 3. I think we got to go in here. All the husbands are dead. So maybe slightly more seriously. So anyway, so Jared's outlined Melian's story and impact in general there, and seeing her weave in and out of the various stories or the incarnations of them, whether it's some of the background information or the short histories, or as more of a direct participant, it always gives a sense of something uncanny. Something or someone, if you can even call Melian someone, not entirely here, for lack of a better word, and not entirely in the grounded world, although she is part of it. Mm-hmm. But to avoid simply repeating what Jared has just discussed, and because, quite frankly, I'm way more interested in what Oriana's thoughts are on the character and the dynamics, as you've already, some of which she's already said, and she'll have more to say soon, I'll delve into how the character changed in Tolkien's writing over the years. Yeah. She is one of the oldest original characters in Middle-earth. She is part of the original Lost Tales from the late 1910s, though like Elwë, who is also known as Thingol. She initially appears under a number of different names before Melian is finally settled on later. And initially, she's only described as a sprite, a fae, a fairy almost in a sort of the diminutive sense to a degree. And in the earliest version of the story, her meeting with Thingol is a rom-com meet-cute. There is no other way to describe it.
Oh, God.
I'm sorry, it is. It's like I had completely forgotten this until I was rereading some of those texts the other day, and I was like, this is how it started? Because basically, it's Elwë in Middle-earth. It's Thingol in Middle-earth. He comes across her. He's first encounters her. He's kind of fascinated. She's gazing at the stars, resting in a bed of leaves in the forests, and he sees her and basically goes, damn, she's hot. The language in Tolkien's a little different.
I mean,
that's
the ancient equivalent of, damn, bro, she hot. Yeah. She fine.
Totally. Completely that. He comes near her, he breaks a twig, and she runs off laughing at him, going, ha, 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 and all that. And then her powers, because of this sense of, being able to sort of drowsiness and enchantment, puts him to sleep for a while. He wakes up later and he wanders the woods looking for her, can't find her, but she's watching over him the whole time. And then they marry off screen. It's sort of like, and they eventually became a couple. It's like, what? It is nothing like the dramatic, formal version of the meeting that you outlined, Jared, where they're standing locked into each other's gaze for 2 centuries. The total antithesis of that. It's way more. I mean, I don't know, Oriana, what would you imagine as the background music for that, or what would be the good song choice for this?
For your version, or for the early?
For the early version, for the rom-com version.
God, I'm like, for some reason, like, I can, I can only picture the Silmarillion version with "Take Your Breath Away," like.
Oh yeah, I can see that.
I don't know why. I don't know. Anyway, please continue before I say more dumb things.
That's not dumb. That's fantastic. So you get a sense of how the story did change over time, which of course is is a strong theme throughout a lot of the early writings, and how he adapted and took it a little more serious, if you will. Made it a little more serious. But at the same time, in these early versions, when it comes to the end of Melian's story, there's a real sense of a darker, almost fraught mental collapse in this version, something that is really not in the Silmarillion at all. Mm-hmm. The tale, which tells of the Noglamir, a famed necklace, and the fall of Doriath, the kingdom of Melian and Thingol, in the Silmarillion, it paints her in high and it's almost silent tragedy, barely says anything. She waits by the body of Thingol, she recalls memories of all her, eons of time with him, then sends a message to Bryan and Luthien, and then leaves to Valinor, withdrawing her protection from Doriath and literally abandoning her people, if they were her people. And that's a big question. Mm-hmm. Again, she is this alien presence who is there, and yet, is part of it all, and yet it seems to be removed from it at the same time. And it's really notable, I should say, that in one of the later manuscript collections, Christopher Tolkien expressed his regret that he chose to create this version of the tale for the Silmarillion. That is one of the newer editions when that was published back in the late 70s. And he did so simply because the original version, which was never fully revisited by Tolkien, was so far removed from the rest of the Silmarillion as it had evolved, similarly to the way that there's only that one complete version of the Fall of Gondolin very early on, and it was never revisited since. Mm-hmm. So when you look at that original Lost Tales version, what happens is she senses she's at their capital, the equivalent of Menegroth, the center of their realm. She senses Thingol's doom coming while he's out on a hunt. And she openly expresses her fear and her doubt to an attendant. And then, shortly thereafter, is confronted with the severed head of Thingol, borne in by the dwarf raiders who had attacked him.
Okay.
So it's a much more direct thing. In the final version of Silmarillion, he's killed underground suddenly by the dwarves and just sort of runs off. This is a much more, dare I say, Game of Thrones version of the story to a degree. It's a lot more violent and immediate. And she escapes in sudden darkness. It's implied that she brings it on from these dwarves who are coming in to attack. And then, to give a quote, Her bitter weeping filled the forest. Now did a great darkness fall upon her mind, and her counsel and her lore forsook her, that she wandered she knew not whither for a great while. Very unlike the Silmarillion Melian. Extremely unlike. This is much more, one could say, human, in the same way that the almost goofy Melian, when she first meets Thingol, the sort of laughing and playing around with him and all that, it's a much different thing. And so sometime later, she meets with the Return from Death Beren and Luthien after their vengeance on the Dwarf Raiders, something that is not in the final version of the Silmarillion, and she is no less upset, distraught specifically, and in seeing the Silmaril that's been recovered along with the Noglamir, says she feels that even that jewel is cursed from all its long years with Melkor. In other words, there's just no escape from the evil, even though the Silmarils are supposed to be the most utterly uncorruptible things impossible. Not so here in this early version of the story. And then she leaves for Valinor, and setting a tone again for that sense of abrupt withdrawal throughout all the story's incarnations. She's here and then she's no longer there. This more removed and watchful alien version of Melian that finally appeared in the Silmarillion as published, and the later tales that were published later by Christopher Tolkien in the History of Middle-earth books, those almost serve as an additional voice of fate alongside Mandos, someone who's thoroughly aware of what's about to happen. Tolkien's post-Lord of the Rings revisions of the Silmarillion material added a lot of those various portentous statements and reactions throughout the Silmarillion itself. The dramatic conversation with Galadriel in particular that reveals the reason why and what happened when the elves left Valinor, and the kinslaying and all this buried history that they didn't want to talk about. But those revisions also contain Tolkien's final, quietly powerful idea for the character regarding the uniqueness of this formal physical incarnation in Middle-earth. And it's talked about via Christopher Tolkien's additions to the Silmarillion, about how she had gained a power over the substance of Arda, but had been bound by the chain and trammels of the flesh of Arda, quote-unquote. But as an otherwise unpublished note in The Peoples of Middle-earth, which is the last of the History of Middle-earth series, has it, and I quote, "It was permitted, no doubt because this was union had been foreseen in the beginning of things, and was woven into the Amarth of the world, when Eru first conceived the being of his children. So even fate has controlled her in this particular thing. She was meant to do this, apparently." And I think that underscores perhaps her most powerful scene in the published Silmarillion, which is another revision that happened after Lord of the Rings was published. It's when Beren and Luthien first return from death to Doriath, and how Luthien revives Thingol from despair. Yet, quote, "Melian looked in her eyes and read the doom that was written there and turned away. No grief of loss has been heavier," end quote. Even more so the Thingol's later death and her departure from Middle-earth. It's here when, precisely because in the end Melian is so utterly inhuman, the fate of her now human daughter shatters her.
It all comes back to death, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Always.
Always.
People always die. Who knew?
It's a shame that I mean it would feel like the earlier versions would feel out of place in the Silmarillion, I know, but I'm glad they exist in those early forms, precisely because it's so good. Like I love some of the early, more immediate, more human elements of these stories.
You know, Tolkien is still also a young man at that point. By that point, he's certainly seen a lot. This famously, he starts really writing these stories after his recovery from being fighting on the war front. There is a sense of, instead of, you have to look beyond the image of the courtly old retired academic that is so often the image. It's sort of like, okay, here's a young man going like, yeah, everyone's sort of, even these ancient figures are very lively, and it fits in with the original conception of the Valar, where you have much more sort of these immediate reactions. Everything's a lot more, playful. I've used as a word before, and it's serious business, but it's serious business that sort of like pulses with life, for lack of a better term. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah, I think you can see that in some of my whole thing is like the Valar seem pretty incompetent, frankly. And I think that's a holdover from, it's buried beneath layers of, very high language, particularly in the Silmarillion. But the actions are all too human. and the errors that, because they do, lots of people making lots of mistakes all the time in these legends. I guess it does kind of like lead in somewhat well to something that I would like to sort of syncretize what you both were talking about, because I think that the key to understanding Melian as a character comes from what you've both already said, which is like Melian's roots are very clearly from Tolkien's love of fairy story, and not like the Hans Christian Andersen type, not the Victorian type, but like the older kind, the kind that's really much more bound to the earth of like the British and the Irish Isles, which is like not fairies, but like the people of the Sidhe and whatnot. These are stories where fairy isn't good or evil, but it's other, and I like. Jared, was it you that were talking about the difference between like Melian's magic, so to speak?
She causes insanity.
Yeah, it's really messed up, but it is a protective magic. It is, it feels very. She feels very much like a fairy queen in the very old school sense of the word, and like it's interesting going back, these early versions I had not read until very recently. I think I might have already talked about this on a different episode, but the earliest version of the story of Beren and Luthien, I think it was just Beren and Tenuviel at that point, where the big bad is a giant cat.
Oh yeah,
called Tevildo.
The Prince of Cats.
There's a fairy logic to it, and to Melian too that kind of takes some getting used to. As you said, Jared, like she's very opaque. Her thoughts are not our thoughts. Nor her ways our ways. What is that? That sounds like something.
That's the Bible.
Yes. Oh my God. Thank you.
You know that.
I was wondering where. Wow. But, like, speaking of the girdle of Melian, like, one of the things that I cannot stop thinking about or talking about these days is totalitarianism. And so, yeah, real light fare for this lovely Sunday afternoon. Yeah. But one of the elements of the story that's most interesting to me right now is what you guys have already talked about, is this concept of binding, the binding of Melian, who is essentially the most powerful being in Middle-earth aside from Melkor, right? Am I crazy? Right? Yes?
Well, like, even he can't, if I remember correctly, and I don't have the Silmarillion in front of me, even he can't get past the girdle.
Yes. So, like, you have this very powerful, but unlike Melkor, who is a totalitarian god, Melkor must be bound by others, but Melian binds herself. Like, she binds her kingdom and the girdle of Melian. It's a protection, but it is also like when you leave that protection, you're gone. Like, you are leaving you're essentially jumping into insanity. But so she binds herself in this kingdom. She binds her physical form to, she takes on a human form. She binds herself to Thingol and to Arda itself. And that's the kind of choice that can only come from a love that is itself boundless. And I find that so interesting and beautiful in contrast to the horrifying boundlessness of Melkor's hatred and malice, where she understands that power, there must be limits on power, including her own. I like that a lot.
This makes me think, in terms of power too, I think it's really interesting to note. And again, this is one of those things that I almost forgotten about until I had done some rereading, about how Galadriel seems to take so much from Melian in terms of a modeling. And the way it's interesting to me is that in Doriath you have Thingol is the king, and is the center figure, even though it's like, well, isn't Melian more powerful by default? Whereas in Lorien, later, even though it's Celeborn and Galadriel, clearly the power behind the throne is the power that is Galadriel. I mean, I'm sorry, there's no other way around it. I mean, there is the material that's in the Unfinished Tales, which I was going to do some delving into just for my own edification here at some point, but or just to reread. But it's almost sort of like, you know, Galadriel's character, so interesting as she is, you know, this figure that's sort of, you know, how she emerges and how she becomes part of the wider story. At some point, especially after, of course, Lord of the Rings, when she's written into this dialogue is written into things where she realizes, oh, basically, it's not said. But, you know, Melian gets the secret out of her. It's almost like, you know, it's sort of like she realizes, oh, I've been outmatched. And that never happens to her again.
That's so true. And that's, you know, her power. That's what I like. I love that she is, you know, these are women of the nightingale, essentially. Like, that's their whole thing, from Melian, Luthien, and Arwen, all about the nightingales at all times. And it was a thing. I went down several rabbit holes. Have you guys ever seen a nightingale, by the way? I did not know what a nightingale looked like. I thought that I don't know why, like, I knew they weren't peacocks, but for some reason I pictured them as very ostentatiously colored, or...
No, they're not.
No.
Yeah.
They're plain little brown things, yeah.
They're little brown birds.
You're like, what? No, you don't... you know. And so it is interesting to me that Tolkien turned this you know, little bird that I would never ever notice, you know, in the wilds, not least of which because they're not in America. They're not native to America, but like, yeah, he turns this plain little thing into the three most beautiful people in Middle Earth. Like, as sort of like a physical incarnation of the beauty and power of the Nightingale's song. And that's like, I remember studying Keats's Ode to a Nightingale in high school, like around the same time that I was reading the Silmarillion for the first time, and kind of immediately grabbed onto the line, "Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird," and being like, oh, nightingales, Silmarillion, oh, I wonder if there's a connection there. I actually don't know. Do you guys know if there was...
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you figure, you know, Tolkien had his preferences in terms of what literature he liked, but at the same time he had a general education. He probably picked that one up along the line. Yeah, so or knowing him, he'd be like, is there a root to this, and try to figure it out if there's some deeper, you know, mythological meaning that you know, what Keats was drawing on or whatever. But you know, doubtless, yeah.
I don't know. I like that. Yeah. So and like you have the three. My reaction to you picking this topic was like, yes, Melian, the first woman in the first woman in Arda to fuck down, starting a great tradition of you know.
And it's all her descendants too.
Yes, the strain runs true. Like...
all two.
It's great. It's like, I wonder if, you know, if anyone ever does like sort of a modern adaptation or like sort of a modernized version, I wonder if they will have people that surround them going like, girl, what are you doing? You know?
Well, Melian doesn't have that, so...
Yeah, I wonder if that was like her rebellious phase, you know?
Her goth teen.
Yes! Oh my god, she was emo. She wanted to go walk and sing in the dark in Middle-earth.
Yeah.
That's true.
She's like...
It's just starting to make more and more sense.
Eru, you're not my dad. Like...
Well, Manwë, you're not my dad.
Yeah.
someone was the dad, if there were a dad, and all that. In fact, that actually leads to a good question. Wasn't it you, Oriana? This is some time before the podcast actually started, but you were digging up info about how in almost the very lightest of ways, one of the few times that Tolkien plays around with a plasticity of gender is how the Ainur, the Valar, and all that don't necessarily have gender.
Yes! Oh, man, that was... I just saw it the other day. The Valar took to themselves shape and hue, and so because they liked the Children of the Iluvatar so much, they were like, oh, we'll look like them. But they don't have to have bodies because it's like clothes for them, essentially. But when they desire to clothe themselves, the Valar take upon them forms, some as of male and some as of female. For that difference of temper they had even from their beginning, it is but bodied forth in the choice of each, not made by the choice, even as with us, male and female may be shown by the raiment, but is not made thereby. Yeah, I always thought that was such an interesting passage, because it's not necessarily like trans-affirming. I don't. Yeah. But it could be read to be trans-affirming, I feel like.
A little bit. I mean, I don't think it makes room for non-binary people, but it does have kind of an interesting, like... Yeah, it's trans-affirming, but upholding the gender binary regardless. Yes. So...
Which,
whatever.
I'm not going to fault him too much, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if, for him, that was the idea that Melian had to be such a person to be wandering in the woods to begin with, because if, Thingol had come across some equivalent of emo dude wandering the forest going like, I'm dark and spooky, it's like, would the appeal have been there? Or would it have been?
Right, like, maybe they just would have been best buddies. Very, very close.
Aww.
Cousins.
Road trip.
We are going to have to get into homosexuality at some point here as a topic, because that could probably take about 3 episodes, but it would be worth it.
Yes.
It would definitely occur. Well, Jared, you kicked off this discussion. What are some of your final thoughts or questions you might have about Melian here?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I didn't talk about in the beginning is the way her story ends is she just, like, says, to hell with this, and leaves, and as far as we know, just ends up sitting in Valinor sad for, I don't know, the rest of the world's existence or something. And that has always been deeply upsetting to me. Like, when I read the Silmarillion for the first time, I was pretty young, so... It just seemed like one of those huge unfairnesses that when you're a kid you're not really prepared to encounter in literature. But I don't know, I totally forgot when I was writing my initial thoughts, I forgot that that's how her story ends, is that, yeah, it is a love story, but it is defined by loss. Her husband dies, she gives up her kingdom, her daughter dies and is lost to her. She has a lot, and then it all goes away. It not goes away so much as it's taken from her. And she has nothing left, so she leaves, and that's, to me, that is sadder than the story of Beren and Luthien, because that's like the way that ends works.
Yeah. In
a way. Not that Melian's story doesn't work, but it feels it's more satisfying, and this is more like, you mean she just goes?
Right.
And she just sits there sad for the rest of her eternal life? Is that really what's happening? So, yeah, she is a tragic figure to me when I can unblock that part of my memory, because I have clearly sealed it off to protect myself.
Well, do we think that Thingol came back from the... Because, like, he is allowed to... Right?
Yeah.
So do we think that maybe eventually, maybe it's after the writing of, the Silmarillion, or, all of this.
After the in-universe writing of it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Maybe.
If it helps you feel better, I don't know.
I don't know.
Or maybe it's actually worse, because that ending is, like, horrible. It's a tragedy, but it's a good. It's well written tragedy. Like,
oh yeah. Which is part of why it's so horrifying to me. It's just like, oh, it works.
Yeah.
It works too well. Yeah, I don't know, but if he did, so this isn't really a final thought so much as the opening of an entirely new thing, but if he did come back from the dead, as they can, what do? Do they pick up where they left off? Would they be happy? Is that really it? Is that a happier ending than her sitting there sad forever?
And because they have problems. Like, if my husband had pulled the kind of shit that he had pulled, it would be a very long Reddit relationships post.
Yeah. Am I the asshole?
Yes! Am I the asshole for being mad at my husband?
No, I like the idea that he comes back and they meet again, and Melian just sort of looks at him and says, like, will you believe me now?
Yeah.
Next time, listen to me.
Yeah.
I told you.
No, you wanted a Silmaril.
Yeah, oh my god. He had a whole kingdom.
You could have just given it up.
Couldn't. You just needed.
Oh dear.
Your mid-age crisis.
Yeah, how do the hormones kick in for elves? This is getting a whole weird area here.
Oh, jeez.
Oh, God. That's a whole episode.
Yeah, so maybe we should wrap up the discussion on this one.
We've gone sufficiently off the rails, I think.
Yeah.
All right, so moving into the conclusion of this week's episode, as always, looking ahead to talking about the next one. Topic choice has come back around to me, and I have been wanting to do something like this for a long while because it is such a underappreciated story, I think. It's not an unknown one. But to explain, this is the first time I think I'm going to ask our listeners, and, well, you guys, but you've already encountered this, I'm sure, but ask our listeners to do a bit of reading work on this. It is fairly short. I'm not asking you to read a full book. But to explain what this is a story that, to my mind, is pretty well unique in the whole Middle-earth cycle, for lack of a better term. Christopher Tolkien said as much when he brought the story to the attention of everybody. It is a peacetime story. It is a domestic drama story. Honestly, nothing like it in Middle-earth. It's a story where you have in-depth discussions between a father and a son over time. It is an in-depth portrayal of a romance that is not a fairy tale romance or a romance of high tragedy. It's about a romance that sputters and dies. And it to my mind, there's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot to talk about. I am looking forward to it. So for the next episode, like you out there in podcast listener land, to read along, because you'll gain a lot from this, I think. It is from the Unfinished Tales, and the story is Aldarion and Arendis, the Mariner's Wife.
I don't think I've read this one.
Oh my god, Jared, you are going to love it. It is like Revolutionary Road, but Numenor. Like,
yes, very accurate.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's really remarkable. I do recommend a couple of specific things for people who, like Jared, seems to be encountering it for the first time. Do read the story. It's in Unfinished Tales. Check out a copy, get a hold of one. You've got some time to do it. But make sure to read the description of Numenor that comes right before it, a very small piece. It sort of acts as an introduction to the story. And absolutely be sure to read the commentary and additional material after the story ends, because it is the Unfinished Tales. It was never fully completed, but there's a lot of further material. And some of that stuff is just mind-blowing for Tolkien. There's nothing else like it in the legendarium. It is a lot of very, very, very interesting work, and I think it's telling too that it's work that happened after Lord of the Rings. This is all work that was done essentially in the mid-'60s. Some of his final work that he ever did on Middle-earth.
Yeah, it is. I remember I actually reread it somewhat recently, so this is like very kismety. But this is one of the reasons I am so excited that the Amazon Lord of the Rings series takes place in the Second Age, because they will have this story to work with, and like, again, depending on casting and whatnot, like, I like cannot wait to it's so unlike everything else. So, oh, yeah, hell yeah.
All right. Well, this is great. Well, I look forward to all your thoughts on it and all that. We'll be doing a little bit of a format change for the next episode. We were just talking about it beforehand. Instead of us doing our sort of 3 lengthy individual installments, you can say, on the topic back and forth, we'll do a thing where I will do the one formal bit, and then we'll sort of discuss open randomly after that. We'll see where the discussion goes, but we'll have ideas from there. So we think that'll just change it up in a good way. We're hopefully that is something that you all enjoy too as listeners. So that's about it. The only other thing to note is that I'll be in New York here in a couple of weeks for a non-Tolkien event. So finally, I'll hopefully get to a chance to meet Oriana, so the podcast hosts can encounter each other at last. So and all that. So Jared, it may have to be
fault you came here when I was in London.
Well, next year maybe. And all that. We'll do things as we go. We won't be able to do a live recording together yet, but there we are. So just to wrap up on a formal level, we'll have further contact details in the outro, of course, as well. Do keep an eye out for the Megaphonic FM Patreon and the t-shirt and other stores and things like this. And if you do join the Patreon, you get to join in where the Slack discussion happens, including the Tolk Talk board, where you can talk with us about all sorts of things. We've had some good chat there already. We really appreciate it. Any final thoughts from you guys?
Give us your money.
Really quickly, Melian fan cast.
Yes.
It could happen.
Yes.
And you Melian fan cast, and who would I have? Tilda Swinton?
Gong Li.
Ooh.
That's my answer. Gong Li.
I don't know why Cate Blanchett isn't right, but she's all I can think of right now. Even though she's Galadriel, I don't know.
I was about to say, she'd act against herself. That'd be pretty good.
What if Galadriel is like a Jared? I'm thinking of your Ditto tweet.
Oh God.
What if Melian just takes the form of whatever the prettiest, or whatever the most beautiful woman in the room is?
So what does she look like when she's alone?
She's immaterial. She shucks her human form. That's the thing. Well, it doesn't matter what she looks like alone because no one can look at her.
If you're beautiful, but you're in your room by yourself, are you really beautiful?
No.
Man, now I'm wondering how Tolkien will work this idea. Maybe again for another topic. All right. So further thoughts and things next time. Look for the show notes as always, and contact info in the outro. And we'll see you all in about a month. Bye, all.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of By-The-Bywater. Please subscribe and rate us via your favorite podcast listening options.
Episodes and show notes are at megaphonic.fm/bythebywater, all one word. You can also message us through here. Email us at bythebywater@megaphonic.fm, or follow us on Twitter at By-The-Bywater.
You can also follow us individually on Twitter and ask questions there. I'm at Vandroid Helsing.
I'm at Schwinter, SCHWINDTER.
And I'm Ned Raggett, 2 G's, 2 T's. By-The-Bywater is a proud member of Megaphonic Podcast Network. Find all our fancy little shows at megaphonic.fm. We hope you join us again next time. Until then, Namarie.